We have a very timely conversation here today. I'm really excited to serve as moderator and it's part of the occasion today. Our center, in addition to the Institute for Social Transformation, I hope I got that right, Chris, as well as Alianza Coachella Valley, is releasing a policy brief in the context of programs like the Build Back Better Regional Challenge from the USEDA and California's Economic Resiliency Fund, that Community Economic Resilience Fund that is also being designed at the moment. We have set out a roadmap in that policy brief in terms of how we can not only take inclusion more seriously, but how to operationalize it, how to measure it, and how to think about indicators to be able to tell the difference between inclusion that is tokenization or window dressing versus inclusion that is deep and authentic. We're going to have opening remarks from our speakers, including Nate Edenhofer, who's one of the co-authors of an early working paper that forms that report, as well as others like Manuel Pastor, who's a co-author with Chris Benner on a recent book, Sylvia Paz from Alianza Coachella Valley, who's an important and strategic partner in all of this work. And then we'll get statewide perspective from Mary Collins from the Office of Planning and Research and Tony Simons from the Assembly. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Manuel Pastor, who's going to talk about the importance of not only an inclusive recovery, but of building economies that are based on solidarity. Manuel, over to you.
Terrific, really good to see you. Last time you were right, I joked about you having 3 jobs. Looks like because of those 3 jobs, you're not shaving any longer. So I don't know whether it's a Miami Vice look or overwork as director of too many things. So let me say a few things just to frame this. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation today, and I want to give way to really the data that's going to be presented about the Coachella Valley and Salton Sea area. But I did want to note 3 things quickly. One is that we seem to be in a deeply transformational moment. Transformational because of what COVID revealed in terms of the underlying fragilities of our society and how many people have been left behind and kept behind. Transformational because I think people's expectations are way up. Part of what is being experienced as a labor shortage and talked about in the business press as a great resignation, people resigning from work, is really a great rebellion against inequality of people saying they don't want to work for low wages. They don't want to work if they're mistreated at work. They have rising expectations about what the economy, our economy, and our society will deliver. They have rising expectations around racial equity. They have rising expectations around government responsiveness. And there is no going back to what we had pre-COVID. That was a normal that did not work for so many. And there's, in the midst of this transformational moment, aspirational aspects of the future. So I think it's been mislabeled as a great resignation in the business press. It's really a great rebellion, and a rebellion of workers, a rebellion of communities that want their voices to be heard, and a rebellion, I would say, of regions like Coachella Valley in inland California that have too often been ignored by the state. So what is the frame to go forward in this transformational moment? Yes, Chris and I have a new book that's out called Solidarity Economics. Frustrating thing, it's a couple hundred pages, and we realized it could actually be said in 3 sentences. So why didn't we just write the 3 sentences? Those 3 sentences are that we need to be talking about our economy and not the economy. Our economy is what we make of it together. Second, that we do better when we have a mutual economy, when we pay attention to each other's needs. And in much of the research we've done, we found that those metropolitan regions in the United States that are more equitable, more racially inclusive, less politically fragmented, are able to sustain job growth over time. So while traditional economics has often taught us that equity comes at the cost of efficiency, that fairness comes at the cost of growth, we need to be understanding the way in which we can marry inclusion and prosperity to get to a better outcome. We also, third sentence in that book, know that movements matter, that it is when people get together in conversations and in communities and can come to consensus about what they want their region to look like, what they want their state to look like, that is when we can change the constellation of policies to really get to an outcome that makes a difference. So what do we need going forward, and why am I so excited about this effort going on in Coachella Valley? I think we need three things. One is we need much better engagement opportunities so that communities can express their concerns and that becomes part of the planning process for regions and the state. Second, we need much better equity metrics, because if we know what we're measuring and define that at the beginning, we can actually get it right going forward. And I'm excited that the policy brief talks so much about equity metrics. When equity is baked in at the beginning rather than sprinkled on at the end, we can make much better progress. And finally, we need any efforts to be paying attention to the climate crisis, to be centering not just equity, but environmental concerns. And I'm really glad to see that this effort does exactly that. And Karthik, unlike most academics, I just did that in the actual time you gave me.
Thank you so much, Manuel. And I love the passion. Who says academics are not passionate, right? And who says economics needs to be the dismal science or boring? None of that is true. And really grateful for your work and Chris's work. I think it's so timely, and really happy that we're able to feature that work here. You didn't plug the book enough, Manuel, so maybe when we come back in the reactions, we could do that. Next, I'd like to invite Sylvia Paz, who is the Executive Director of Alianza Coachella Valley, and we'll talk about the importance. So the brief that you'll see pretty soon on our main page at the Center for Social Innovation, you can just go to socialinnovation.ucr.edu. It is our Salton Sea, where theory meets practice on inclusive economic development. And Sylvia is one of those rare persons who operates in both worlds and is able to ground things when we on the theory side get maybe a little too flighty, but also making sure that people on the ground are raising their sights and not just reacting to the here and now, but able to see that bigger picture. Sylvia, welcome.
Well, thank you, Karthik, and thank you, Manuel, for your words, because I completely agree about what you've said around the moment we're in. And the question for me has been, well, how do we capture the moment, right? And how we, as the communities where I've grown up and where I work, it's been exciting to see, for example, that this moment has really been manifesting itself probably in the last decade, being framed by people like Manuel Pastor, Chris Benner, and their work on equity. I'm really excited about the book that's coming out. It's also, I've seen it being acted upon by state policies, right? And there has been communities that are asserting themselves and continue to do that. So, for example, we've had, the movement towards the local control funding formula so that we more equitably fund education, the transformative climate community grants that focus on disadvantaged communities. And we're finally talking about how do we systematically change the way we do economic development so that we can really have an impact on the ground, on the communities that have been the most impacted really by the COVID pandemic. So while there's been all these great movement, I want to talk about how this has looked like on the ground, because yes, it has provided us a powerful narrative that begins to recognize the assets found in communities of color. But in communities like those surrounding the Salton Sea, mostly agricultural, Spanish-speaking workforce, sort of the theory and the policy are a wide net, where unless there is a willingness and an investment in understanding and addressing the nuances of a place, we underdeliver for rural communities. We underdeliver for unincorporated communities and for immigrant communities. And this is sort of where my mind was and a couple of months into the pandemic, right? We started seeing the devastating impact in these frontline communities where we have farm workers showing up to work, grocery workers showing up to work, and then coming home to crowded communities, coming home to houses that lack the broadband infrastructure so that students can connect via Zoom to their education. And at Alianza, we mobilized and started delivering food at people's doorsteps in the mostly geographically distant communities. We dedicated some of our general operation dollars for cash assistance. And to date, we have been able to give out $2.3 million to families who were affected by COVID. And this is an organization that was not what we did. We focused on policy and systems change work. And the fortunate part that we were able to do this is that with every check came a story. And with every story, for me, came a fear that when the risk of COVID was a thing of the past, that when the influx of dollars had stopped, that the rural communities surrounding the Salton Sea will still not have a fair shot at recovering from the pandemic. And that fear, I realized, has been rooted in a lack of trust that the people that are driving the conversation understand the nuances of the communities like mine, right? That, we have experts around developing training programs, we have developers around the table, we have business owners, and we focus on this great, a just transition, which is great. And the question for me is, how does a community like mine achieve a just transition when we don't have adequate roads, when we don't have adequate broadband, when we don't have connections to sewers, to water lines? And so in essence, there's very few of the people that I've seen, at least involved, have looked at economic development as community development. So a few months into the pandemic, this is what's going through my mind. And I start talking to Tony, I start talking to Chris, to Karthik, to Manuel. I'm like, look, we need to put something out there that's going to change the way things are being done. And what we are doing, and I think the uniqueness of our efforts is that we are combining research and community practice that I hope will answer the question of what are the things that need to be placed in a community so that they can have a real opportunity to thrive, right? So what are those things that are essential? What does the literature say? And then not just stop there, but then talk to the community. Look, this is what we're hearing. What are the things that you see are not being addressed here? And we started this conversation recently, just one of many conversations we're going to have, where people are starting to tell us, well, it's infrastructure. Yeah, it's the jobs, and there's all these great things that can happen. But ultimately, if I don't have a house and there's not the existing infrastructure, how do we get there? So at the end, I believe that we are going to redefine economic development to be more than the attraction and retention of businesses. At least that's my hope. And that there's a real investment in the infrastructure, both the built infrastructure, but also the capacity infrastructure that exists in our communities. And that this work can really be a game changer for how at least the communities around the Salton Sea recover from the Salton Sea, but also can influence all the great efforts that are coming out of the state of California. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sylvia. I agree that I think we are fortunate in many ways in the state of California. I'll be hearing later from both Mary and Tony. Many other states haven't created the kinds of programs coming out of the American Rescue Plan that California has done. I think now the key will be to show, I believe, not only the federal government, but hopefully many other states, in terms of what can truly be achieved in terms of delivering on the promises of inclusive, sustainable, equitable development. Next, I'm going to ask Nate Edenhofer from UC Santa Cruz to talk about the research that he was invited he and his colleague Alejandro, as well as Chris Benner, were invited to do in terms of taking frameworks such as those generated by Chris and Manuel and others throughout the country, throughout the world, and to be able to say something about rural economies like the Salton Sea region, which includes Eastern Coachella Valley and Imperial Valley. Nate, over to you.
Thanks, Karthik. Yeah, hi everyone. So my name's Nate Edenhofer. I'm a PhD student in the politics program at UC Santa Cruz. And yeah, I want to share a little bit about that report that Dr. Alejandro Artiga-Purcell and I wrote for Alianza that uses Chris and Manuel's solidarity economics framework to propose ways to measure and build an inclusive and sustainable economy with an eye to the Salton Sea region. The first piece of the report develops a series of indicators that are able to measure the economy in ways beyond only economic growth, and it's based around 5 main areas. First, equity, including upward mobility and the reduction of inequality. Second, inclusion and participation, including inclusion in economic life and participation in economic decision-making. Third, growth and stability, including employment stability and dignified work. Fourth, socio-ecological health, including the health of local ecosystems and the health of community residents. And fifth, transportation and geographical access to development, which includes commute times and infrastructure, which Sylvia was speaking about. What these different ways of measuring the economy put front and center is that the actual lives and well-being of the residents living in any region should be the standard of measurement rather than merely economic growth, because economic growth and huge amounts of wealth often coincide with severe inequality, poverty, or human and environmental health. So the second part of the report uses this sort of framework and moves on to some strategies for building an inclusive economy. We spend time first exploring the ways of analyzing how to ensure that participation is meaningful, and then focus on 2 overarching strategies for inclusive development. One is confronting inequality directly, and the other is fostering collaboration and mutuality in the economy. So some examples from the report include confronting the sources of inequality in the workplace, which means unionization for non-unionized workers and the development of worker centers that support and organize workers in difficult to unionize industries, especially those with rampant wage theft, including things like agriculture. More collaborative projects could include developing career ladder programs. So the Salton Sea region has a shortage of nurses, and with training, people already employed in the healthcare and social service sector could have a pathway to good nursing jobs. Anchor institution collaborations are efforts that should be considered, which involve harnessing the purchasing power of large nonprofit or public institutions like hospitals or universities to support new local business endeavors, most transformatively supporting worker-owned cooperatives. Worker-owned businesses could also be created through building institutions to support the transfer of baby boomer-owned businesses to their employees as they retire. Public sector actions to support inclusive and equitable economies could include creating new public transportation initiatives with participatory planning. Housing affordability and renters should be protected through land banking, land trusts, and zoning and tax policies. Furthermore, the impact of local resident voices on regional development can be improved through participatory budgeting. The report also discusses strategies for benefiting from new large-scale projects. Unfortunately, new large-scale endeavors like lithium mining, things like that are set to occur in the Salton Sea region will not automatically benefit residents, in part due to industry practices of hiring long-distance commuting workers from outside project regions. This means that local residents might end up with any of the problems from something like lithium extraction without the economic benefits of employment, things like that. This is one area where some kind of community organizing and participation will be necessary to ensure health, environmental, and employment guarantees for residents. Furthermore, the process of building linkages in the economy to a new investment is also by no means automatic, but will require coordination and the involvement of the state and not simply free market strategies. So some steps can also be taken to benefit local residents in these scenarios. For example, Any public projects can include project labor agreements that include community workforce agreements, where unions are hired along with provisions that include mandatory amounts of local and disadvantaged people to be hired, along with job training to support workforce development. And much of the broad strokes of this analysis is included in a policy brief that Karthik and the team at UCR's Center for Social Innovation have also put together that we've talked about with an eye to its relevance to the Build Back Better Regional Challenge and the California's Community Economic Resilience Fund. So thanks. Back to
Great.
Karthik.
Thank you, Nate. And thank you to the entire team at CSI who've been working behind the scenes. So if you go to our website now, you will be able to click on that link and see that draft. I would say that's probably as good as the final. There's probably a few tweaks that we'll be making and having it finalized on Monday to publish. Thank you, Nate, for your partnership in this work, and Alejandra's as well. And it's great to see people at an early stage of their academic careers that are doing research that is meaningful for community and has public impact. Next, I'd like to welcome Mary Collins from the Office of Planning and Research. Mary will introduce herself and her role at OPR. Mary will speak on the Community Economic Resilience Fund, as well as more generally the work that they're trying to advance on inclusion, sustainability, and equity. Mary, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of these amazing thought leaders and community leaders. So my name is Mary Collins, pronouns she, her. I'm coming to you today from Ohlone and Chochenyo land, which is now called Oakland, California. And as Karthik mentioned, I'm the program manager for the Community Economic Resilience Fund. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat today. So I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about this fund. I feel like Professor Pastor and Sylvia really teed up the moment that we're in, the challenges that we see. So I'm going to put the legislation in the chat. This was signed a couple of weeks ago, the Community Economic Resilience Fund. It's SB 162, and it's a $600 million ARPA funded, so American Rescue Plan Act funded program. An acronym we use because we all love acronyms is SURF. So throwing another acronym out at you all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the program since we've kind of teed up this moment, as I mentioned. So the first part of this is regional inclusive planning. And, from the big picture, we know that bottom-up planning is really important because each of California's regions faces really unique challenges, but also opportunities that all demand localized solutions. So we know these solutions, these opportunities, these challenges, and that competitive advantages are different than the Coachella Valley from Los Angeles, from Kern County, and that of Humboldt County. And talking to stakeholders from around the state, we know that folks want agency and planning for their region's economic future. And Nate talked about inclusive planning processes, and that's one of the core tenets of this program. So, bringing perspectives from labor, business, community, environmental justice. This is an essential step in creating equitable outcomes. And it's really important that a plan for a region's economic future isn't just made by, some guy from McKinsey that lives in Connecticut and has never been to the Coachella Valley, right? Like they don't understand the challenges and what's going on the ground. So we need to have community members, workers, all sorts of different organizations at the table, creating that vision for our future. So what is this going to look like in practice in terms of the actual grant? We're going to have about 13 different regions, $5 million for planning in each of those regions. And so that's going to support engagement and relationship building with diverse stakeholders, the development of these integrated economic plans to diversify our economy and prepare for shifts and changes in industries. And it'll include different analysis, industry analysis, labor market analysis, things like that. And the creation of these strategies that support the development of sustainable industries and well-paying jobs. And I'd say that success in this planning phase, in this initial planning phase, this would look like inclusive, diverse, transparent, and accountable regional planning processes that result in holistic strategies and a recommended series of investments to grow sustainable industries that create and increase access to high quality jobs that have those standards that we talked about earlier. Thinking about labor standards, because that's incredibly important, and I think you'll see that that's also in the legislation. So, for example, let's say the Central Coast, they came together with an inclusive manner. They did the analysis and they had a plan for developing an offshore wind industry. So they might say, in order to make this a reality and pair with other investments from the federal government, from the state government, we might need an incubator or specific infrastructure investments to see that move forward. So that kind of brings us along to the second phase, which is the implementation phase. So all of these regions around the state have created their planning tables, their inclusive planning tables, and that's going to account for, sub-regional planning. We understand that economies aren't going to stop at these borders, that these 13 different borders that we've created, right? So there's going to be flexibility for sub-regional thinking across borders, because there's going to be a lot of investments and projects that are going to cross borders. And we want to see, the consideration of equity, sustainability, in these economic diversification plans. And so, there might be a number of different investments ranging from entrepreneurship and commercialization programs that would connect small minority-owned businesses to industrial hubs and research institutions. And with because I only have a couple of minutes left here, I'll just talk about some next steps that are coming along the line, and so how people can engage and participate as we're putting things together. So next, we're going to be putting out a memo for public comment that looks at the regional boundaries that we're creating for these planning regions. That should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. We'll have things on our OPR website, and we'll be putting things out to our listserv. We'll share with Karthik and the teams here to also distribute to these other listservs. And we have an interagency leadership team from GoBiz, Labor, and OPR that are in the process of creating guidelines. In November, we plan to put out some draft guidelines for comment. In December, we're going to have an informational webinar, and our goal is to put out the RFP in January, in late January. So with that, I think I'm at the end of my time here, so I'm going to wrap up, and I really look forward to collaborating with all of you on this program.
Thank you so much, Mary. And we didn't have a chance to read everyone's bios. I'm going to ask some colleagues if they can drop those in the chat. But Mary, just thank you for your service even prior to this, but even your service now in this role for a more vibrant economic and future for our state. And we'll have plenty of time in both in moderator Q&A as well as audience Q&A if folks have more questions on the details of SURF. Next, we have Tony Simons from the Assembly Jobs, Economic Development and the Economy Committee. And Tony will talk both about SURF as well as other topics that are near and dear to the committee in terms of this long-term interest in regions that have traditionally not seen the kind of economic prosperity and investment that other parts of our state have seen. Tony, welcome.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. I really appreciate being invited to join in today's important conversation. So the Assembly Committee on Jobs, Economic Development, and the Economy is one of 33 standing committees in the California State Assembly. And for the past 15 years, I've served as the Senior Policy Advisor to the committee, where my work has included analysis and evaluation of issues related to economic and community development, with a particular emphasis on justice. So the role of the legislature in comparison to the administration, while the administration rolls out programs and implements them, the role of the legislature, of course, is to set parameters, set new policies, and then do oversight to ensure that they're achieving the goals that are most important. And for the past two sessions, Assemblymember Sabrina Cervantes, who represents the Western Riverside County, has served as our chair. And a hallmark of Chair Cervantes' leadership has been to challenge us to move beyond policy statements and justice, about justice and inclusivity, and really get down to how do we operationalize and actually implement on the ground? Now, because as I said, the legislature is setting policy, the challenge is slightly different, and that is that how do we design programs in legislation to ensure that they can be operationalized and implemented on the ground? I think that the Rise and Ready framework, which is the subject of today's event, and then also the SURF program, which Mary just discussed, are really two great examples of the type of programs that the committee likes to engage on. In fact, in the case of the SURF program, its legislative roots actually grew out of discussions that the committee participated in as part of the California Economic Summit process, and later included in legislation by Assemblymember Salas from the Central Valley, and then were significantly modified during our committee's legislative review. Another program that our committee had a lot of involvement in that's related to today's discussion is the Breaking Barriers to Employment Bill, or AB 1111, and that workforce training bill focused exclusively on serving individuals from groups who face systemic barriers to employment. And that's really one of the things that we look at, that we often see that state programs will focus at maybe a sweet spot or easier to reach. And unfortunately, that means that we tend to drive a lot of dollars towards the status quo and very few dollars towards those programs that actually open new areas. But that's why I think that both the Rise and Ready framework as well as the solidarity economics concepts, they can really offer some new insights into resolving a number of challenges that have historically impeded the operation of inclusive economic development programs. We want to be looking at issues like who are the appropriate conveners and how can applications from regional collaboratives truly show that they are able to set an inclusive discussion table. How can programs be designed to mandate and then verify that local partners and historically underserved groups play a meaningful part in the decision-making process and will actually ultimately benefit from publicly funded programs? And then how do community-based efforts align with and ultimately integrate within local, regional, and state official government actions? In the case of SURF, I think one of the strongest pieces, aside from all of the various things that Mary mentioned, but also it's the policy that says we'll first put out the $2 million in planning grants, which will be followed by $550 million or more in implementation dollars. But perhaps our greatest challenge as we look at inclusive economic recovery strategies is really about the issue of whether or not the programs have real community inclusion in decision making. And this means that we have that and we respect that inclusion even when the process ultimately ends up that what happens on the ground is that the priorities and the needs of marginalized groups do not necessarily align with existing power players. In fact, this is really one of the reasons that our committee is a co-convener of the Committee for a Thriving Coachella Valley and their work to create an inclusive economic recovery blueprint for the Salton Sea and the development of a lithium industry cluster that can serve as a foundation for longer-term economic prosperity for the region. It's quite unique, this experiment with the Salton Sea area, to actually have high quality research combined with community practice. But we believe at the Assembly Jobs Committee that this is going to help us explore real engagement practices, including tools for collaborative policy setting, respectful and ongoing consultations, and examining new ways to develop inclusive, respectful, and neighborhood level methodologies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. Other speakers, if you could turn on your cameras again, we're going to go into a little round robin set of conversations. I'm going to call on particular folks, but others, if you want to maybe raise your hand to jump in, virtually raise your hand, that'd be great, and I'll call on you. I should mention that the Rise and Ready framework and the other frameworks Tony's mentioning, if you go to our website, you can find those there. And we'll also have a chance to talk again, both theory and practice. Part of what I find really exciting, I think I see some of the folks on the call that were party to the US EDA's Build Back Better regional what is it? It was the BBBRC. It was like the regional cluster. I don't know if it was called regional coalition opportunity. And there were things that were kind of opaque in terms of what would count as a good proposal, what would be looked very favorably upon, what wouldn't be. And for a lot of folks, they were hoping that it wouldn't be business as usual, that it would indeed be built back better. But it's hard to tell. And I think the proof will be in the pudding. But part of what I'm hopeful for as we think about SURF, and Mary, really excited to see the kind of guidance that'll be drafted and enable the public to weigh in, is what can we do to iterate and improve on those frameworks? Because we know that in prior programs, those rules have been very consequential, but also how can we build in adaptation and evolution into those rules? Thank you, folks, for highlighting all the speakers. So first, I'm going to actually go back to Manuel. We've gone from the national and global in terms of what's in the air in terms of this new kinds of frameworks and models, and with the hope that this time will indeed be different. Manuel, can you talk about it? I believe your book with Chris, it came out in the UK before it came out in the US. It's kind of sad that the UK is ahead of us. I don't want to truly say that, but yeah, can you kind of take us back to kind of situating the Salton Sea region in California in terms of what's going on nationally and globally, and what makes you excited about being in California to try to advance some of this work?
Well, thanks for plugging the book one more time. And I will say again that it has been released in the United Kingdom. It'll be released in paper very soon in the United States, I think this month or early next. But it's available as a free download because that's how much solidarity we have with readers. Yes. So one of the things to say is I think that what's absolutely critical is that just in the last year, as we've recognized that if you don't get public health assistance to everyone in the state, that you run the risk of a pandemic that will be uncontrolled. That if we don't consider the people who are on the worst side of policing, we're not going to be able to improve community safety for everyone. And if we're not lifting up the bottom of the labor force, we're not going to be able to generate prosperity that's sustainable for a longer period of time. That California is increasingly realizing that it can't leave regions like Coachella Valley behind. I think we've seen, both the governor's leadership on this, and I would say the governor's a smart political figure responding to the fact that inland California has begun to organize itself to be able to get that kind of attention. Karthik, the formation of the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside, and all of your partnerships in the Coachella Valley, the Inland Empire, Inland Valley, and the Central Valley have been critical to making sure that people pay attention to this region. So I hope I'm addressing the question that you're asking. I'm hopeful, and I think Mary and Tony can verify whether I'm not right, that this is not temporary, that people have realized that the part of California that has the biggest youth population, the most kids under the age of 18, it's inland California. The part of California where people are moving because they can still buy houses, it's inland California. I still want a lot of attention on LA. Particularly, I want the Dodgers to win. But we know that policy attention needs to be driven to inland California, because if we continue to have two Californias, not just in terms of the disparity between the wealthy and the less affluent, not just between white and better off Californians and communities of color where poverty is concentrated, but also two Californians in terms of a thriving coastal high-tech entertainment biotech, etc., and an inland California that is not thriving when there is so much human capital, so much willingness to come together, so much opportunity, that's not going to be a healthy California in the long run.
Thank you. Thank you, Manuel. I'm going to actually ask Tony, I mean, you spoke of the governor, but Tony, if you can speak about the legislature. Of course, the legislature represents all of California, as does the governor. But have you noticed any difference over the last few years in terms of attention to inland areas?
Oh, I think definitely. I think that it is only as we start to see a broader recognition of who makes up California that you start to see, particularly the Latino caucus, the Black caucus, as well as members who represent the inland California. And I think part of that is why we've been able to advance issues like climate change. That as we talk about a transition to a carbon neutral economy, prior to that, it actually, what you really were saying, what you were hearing from members is that our communities are disenfranchised. You always have a new thing to sell us, but at the end of the day, our communities don't participate. I think in seeing more inclusive policies, and that means specifically geographic as well as race and ethnicity, I think you're seeing a much more a coming together to allow us to advance other policies.
Great. Thank you, Tony. One of the, Manuel, and thanks for the lift up on the inland California work. There's an op-ed that Kathleen Kelly-Janis, who's the governor's senior advisor on social innovation, and I did for SSIR. We talked about paying attention to the intersection of regional equity and racial equity. Often people talk about racial equity as a predominantly dense urban issue, and often in the coastal areas, right? And they talk about regional equity, just talking about regions without talking about the people in those regions and equity within those regions. So I'm hopeful that not only our conversations and thinking, but hopefully our policies and investments will follow into those through lines, and not to see those as either or, but really to explore the intersections between the two.
The one thing that's in the report is a bit of data from the National Equity Atlas, which we maintain with PolicyLink, about how closing the racial gap can actually lead to prosperity in Coachella Valley, but in other regions of California as well. When you think about how much talent we are leaving to one side when we don't make the proper investments in education, in regional equity, in racial equity, when you think about how much human capital has been permanently damaged by a system of over-incarceration in the state, when you think about how much hurt takes place unless the state of California recognizes the 2.4 undocumented Californians and the nearly 2.6 US-born and green card holder family members who live with them, and how they get access to the kind of programs that are going to be necessary. We just really fundamentally need to reject the traditional economic assumption that paying attention to inclusion is going to cost us either productivity or prosperity. In fact, these can really be wed together. And that's why I'm really optimistic about this report and about what's happening in your office as well, Mary.
Great. Thank you, Manuel. And that's, by the way, folks, that's why we called ourselves the Center for Social Innovation when we started 3.5 years ago. All sorts of reasons. But part of it is when people think about the geography of where innovation is happening, they think of it largely happening in the Bay Area and in coastal Southern California. So it's not just about inland, it's also parts north in California, Central Coast, that often have been overlooked. People don't recognize the incredible talent and innovation that we have. I'm going to go over to Sylvia. And Sylvia, if you can speak about rural areas and what, especially in light of, say, the US EDA's Build Back Better program, as well as other programs you've seen over the years. What do they get right and what do they need to do better in terms of paying attention to inclusion and equity and sustainability in rural areas, like in Eastern Coachella Valley?
Yeah, thank you. Like I mentioned earlier, I think California has the right frameworks, right? We're elevating equity and inclusion. There's been policies in place. And I think the challenge in front of us is how do we operate this so that it doesn't become just a box that people are checking, right? So when we're talking about community inclusion, what I've seen even with the local control funding formula, which has at the core engagement piece, school districts are using that money to fund the things that they need to fund or that they want to fund. And then they come to the public with already a plan in place, not necessarily asking them, what are your priorities? Help me understand, even from student engagement, help me understand what your need as a student is so that we can develop and invest in the programs that are going to meet those needs. But they have a meeting, they tell them this is what we're going to do, and then we can cross the box that we engage the community, right? That's not true community engagement, that's informing people of what you plan to do, which it's good, but we need to get to the next step. Informing is not enough. The other piece is when we're talking about rural communities, and even with the transformational climate communities grants, for example, for a long time, we've had unincorporated communities not being able to apply for the implementation dollars. And it wasn't until recently that the implementation dollars were extended to those who had received, so prior recipients of the planning grants that had unincorporated communities in their regional planning. So unless you had that application, which I think a lot, it was a disincentive, right? When unincorporated communities weren't able to apply for implementation, why would we start planning? So there's very few communities that now fall under and that were ready to then apply for the implementation dollars. So when we're talking again about inclusion and equity, it's let's build with the community, as Tony has said, that even when those things might not be in alignment, and there's real reasons why, right? It's because we cannot start. I mean, years ago, people would ask us at Alianza, why are you not working on the Salton Sea? It's such a critical issue. And we're like, we're trying to address the fact that people cannot get clean drinking water when they open a faucet, right? So how can we move people from there to then start caring about the Salton Sea and the environment, which is a huge, long-term problem that we've been facing. So I think those are the real lessons that we do need to meet community where they are at, that we need to plan with them and not for them. And about the readiness framework, or the readiness part of the Rise and Ready framework, we need to really focus on the readiness piece. So when we're talking about these applications for the Build Back Better Challenge, I had a very open conversation with Karthik about how disappointing it was to see who are the institutions that are capable of even submitting and put the time in submitting those grants, who they're submitting them in favor of, and whether truly this is going to be opening doors and opportunities for the people that were meant to be helping. And again, it's not that we're not going to see projects, but there's been a history of just mismatch. In the conversation we were having with community members, there's a mismatch between what businesses and other people of power want to see in a community to where the community is and where the community wants to go. So we end up with great programs that are not being effective on the ground.
Thank you, Sylvia. And we'll come back to that. I'm going to go to Mary, and I'll kind of tee it up in a certain way. So we talk about this Rise and Ready framework. It's in response to this notion of shovel readiness, which whenever you have any kind of stimulus programs, and Manuel, I'll let you tell I loved your little quip about shovel readiness. So I'm going to cue Manuel and I'll take the mic back. Go ahead, Manuel.
I just commented that we always know that what is shovel ready is manure.
Yeah.
And so we need to be quite careful when we use that term and think about, and I know you're going to tee this up, what it means to make it community ready. That is what it means to make sure that the application process is something that's going to capacitar, that's going to give capabilities to communities to be able to compete, so that the community can be ready, but we need to think about that from the program design perspective. Is the program community ready?
Absolutely, Manuel. I think it's similar to other frameworks when we say making sure that educational institutions are student ready, as opposed to see if the students are ready for those institutions, right? So to think intentionally about institutional design and how they not only can they enable, how they are excluding and marginalizing right now, actively harming, and what we can do to repair and to design better. So I'm going to go to Mary but to ask about, so you are someone is going to be helping with implementation. Readiness is not trivial, right? So you can have all of the aspirations, but if you don't have certain pieces in place, it's not necessarily a recipe for success. So what's the kind of advice you would give for coalitions that want to build packages together that would be competitive in the sense that you want to see impact, and you're trying to hold both pieces of it, right? You want to see things that would produce the kinds of jobs, the kinds of economic activity at scale that you want to see. And yet at the same time, it's not that old model of shovel readiness in which community is either marginalized or just tokenized and barely empowered within those projects and plans. So any thoughts, Mary, in terms of what kind of rules and frameworks from the get-go could maybe prevent some of those problems later on in implementation?
Yeah, and one of the first things I think about is what Sylvia mentioned about checking a box on inclusivity, right? Like, how do we set this up so that there is meaningful participation? So what is the table where these conversations are happening? And part of the thing that's on my brain quite a lot is the dance between taking advantage of this moment and ensuring that we get funds out the door in a timely manner so that groups have more time to work on it. But then also, folks need time to, potentially build relationships and reach out to other organizations and start to coalesce around, who would be applying to a role as a kind of neutral convener role. And we'll have more guidance coming out in the next couple of weeks on some of those definitions for public comment and public input, which we welcome everyone here to provide input on. We are talking with our friends in philanthropy, for instance, about help here in the short term, because we are working with these different agencies to get guidelines go up and running. But at the same time, everybody needs to be having these conversations about is this something that we want to apply to, and who is the appropriate organization, and we're going to fund one convener per region, and so that's something that we want to ensure that there's not competing applications and regional tables, right? We want to be able to have labor, community, environmental justice, business at the same table, and talking about that is easy, but doing it is hard. I remember when I did Peace Corps Panama, and I worked for Peace Corps, and I remember we did infrastructure projects, and we would have people living in the community for 6 years before even starting an infrastructure project, because those relationships take time, that community capacity building takes time. And so that's one of those that's on my mind right now as we're trying to prepare to get this out the door.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary.
If I can add
Sylvia, and then Manuel after that. Go ahead, Sylvia.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. So, very critical about the structure of the tables, right? Thinking about who's at the table, but also who's setting the table. And I think they're both as important, to having a successful partnership and collaborative. The other piece is about understanding that there is already a lot, at least in the state and in inland California, there are tables already that said maybe they're not complete tables. Maybe these are tables that need, to grow, and with the proper resources and support and capacity can do that. But I'll just point out, I mean, you're mentioning 13 regional tables, and I mean, the California Endowment just finished their BHC initiative, which established 13 tables across, or 14 tables across the state. So again, just keeping in mind and about the local context, about the assets that are already there versus thinking that we're going to have to import, which happens a lot in regions like the Coachella Valley, that there's this feeling like, well, there's nothing there, so we're going to have to bring somebody from, I won't say any community name just so that not to offend, but there's not always a need to import talent, but there's always a need, as Manuel Pastor was saying, like, how do we continue to build the capacity that exists in these places?
Thank you, Sylvia. Now, Mary in the chat had noted, I love that mental image of that consultant in Connecticut who's going to like dream up these ideas. And I'll say this as, as an institution that is, we're in the Inland Empire, but, it's still a fair distance away. And we try to be as mindful and respectful in terms of how we co-develop that capacity. And I think we can always do better, to make sure that community organizations can increasingly do things on their own and lead rather than be dependent on academic institutions for this work. Manuel, I know you want to talk, and we had that queued up in some of our prep remarks about the TCC program and maybe some important lessons learned there. OPR is involved here. They're involved in TCC as well. You were involved in transforming climate communities. So some thoughts there, and then we'll go to Nate and then to Chris for some reactor remarks. Go ahead, Manuel.
Fantastic. I wanted to say before that amongst the many assets that the Coachella Valley has, one of them is Sylvia Bass. Sylvia, you are fearless. You are determined. You dragged all of us into your enterprise. And I know that you're getting the state to pay attention. I think there's many great people in or from Coachella Valley. I know you know my good friend, Juan de Lara, who I think is a fantastic representative of that community as well, even though he's now living, I think, in Claremont. But boy, you are an asset and it really should be said and recognized. So I was lucky enough to be on the Strategic Growth Council when the Transformative Climate Communities program was being developed. And I think a couple of lessons from that are key. One is that while TCC did on paper have as its purpose the whole idea of, a whole community effort around climate and climate justice, in part, it was a response to the fact that we noticed through our earlier affordable housing and sustainable communities grants that they were disproportionately going to the Bay Area and somewhat to Los Angeles, a little bit that needed to be corrected in the first year, because there was already a lot of existing capacity in those areas to put out applications that looked good on paper. And so the Transformative Climate Communities actually tried to aim its efforts at communities that were at the highest, meaning worst, Calvin virus screen scores, so most environmentally overexposed and socially vulnerable. So I think that's really important in program design, to make sure that the targeting you're doing is targeting that takes into account need and capacity and the need to build capacity. TCC also gave out planning grants so that people could design beforehand what they were going to do. And then I think another very important thing was to think about what stood in the way of community participation and what would encourage community participation. In the case of Fresno, for example, one of the early requirements or pluses you could have in an application was whether or not your community was close to high-speed rail. Made a lot of sense because a lot of money was going into high-speed rail. But what it meant was that communities about 4 or 5 miles away in Southwest Fresno from where the rail station was going to be didn't have a lot of leverage. I was on Strategic Growth Council. I asked the question, is that actually in the legislation or did we make that up? Turned out we made that up. once we got rid of it, downtown had to negotiate with poorer communities. And they launched a really model participatory budgeting procedure that actually built what Chris and I, in fancy academic terms, call epistemic communities. We have to say that because it's got a lot of syllables and it makes it sound really rigorous. But all it is what you know and who you know it with. And through participatory budgeting, people from low-income communities, from environmental justice communities, came into direct contact with civic leaders, the philanthropic community, and the business community, and had to figure out where their common ground was. So I think every rule we can come up with that forces the conversation where those conversations have not typically taken place, that creates inducements for those kind of conversations. And that, for example, in the case of Pacoima, honored the early work that Pacoima Beautiful did, laying out its own plans for that community. Everything we can do to build on what is already there and to incentivize conversations that might not otherwise take place. Those are the program design elements about making a program community ready by making it community friendly.
Great. Thanks, Manuel. Quick thing I'll say before going to Nate is, I think, and Mary, thanks for lifting up the point about philanthropy playing a constructive role here. I really hope local governments, including any on this call today and who will be viewing this recording later, I think this is going to be such an amazing and impactful conversation, that local governments are not just waiting for philanthropy to be doing the work that they should be doing anyway. And I hope that when it comes to judges of these applications and what these application forms look like, that governments that have shown either demonstrated track record or real commitment to be able to sniff out the difference between BS or words and actual track records or true intentionality with co-investments to get it done is something that I think that various institutions, including economic development agencies, as well as businesses and developers should I think it should be on their radar. If we are going to build a different system, I think potentially, I don't want to freight too much into SURF and what it could do as the thing that's going to change everything in California. But we're thinking a century ahead. If we can do some of these things that can accelerate some of those changes, I think we'll be in a better position. Nate, I know you wanted to say a bit about how do you detect and how do you enable more meaningful participation?
Yeah, thanks, Karthik. Because one thing people have been bringing up is this community input or participation just a box to check? Is it just a rubber stamp, or is it something, how can it become something? It exists on a spectrum. How can we tell that it's going to be something that's more empowering to communities? And we actually spend a decent amount of time in our report, and there's a little bit of this in the policy brief too, but more detail in the report discussing how to measure meaningful participation. And so I just wanted to say like a few kind of like of the things that came up over and over in the literature on this is that first, you need to be making the participation should be around economically significant decisions. So it needs to have like a serious scope to what you're actually participating around, the community's input is on. There needs to be some kind of guaranteed influence for the participants. It can't just be that they are, informing isn't quite enough, right? They have to be able to influence the outcome. People have to actually be brought into the process. They have to actually make it to the, inclusive spaces or spaces of participation in planning. It's better for these to be mobilized through networks rather than isolated individuals, bringing community groups, organizations, things like that into these spaces. There needs to be time for deliberation, right? So as I believe Sylvia was saying, right, not just bringing a plan already made to be checked off, right? There has to be time to deliberate what actually is going into the plan and what is going to be coming out of it. People have to be able to have a certain, we could say, democratization of knowledge, where they're able to, people, if they don't have technical expertise, can be brought up to a level that allows that deliberation, or to be able to include the experiential knowledge of participants in planning. So what the community has gone through and what they need, which might be just the basic infrastructure and access to water might be it, something that is left off the table that the community knows. And then the methods and schedules of participation, any sort of inclusive planning, it needs to be very accessible. There should be multiple ways to do it. There should be adequate, it should be at a time that working people can make. It should be close to transportation and things like that, made accessible to them. And so those factors together, which is a difficult list, not to say that it's just easy to do this like with the snap of a finger, those factors can help to promote any participation to be something that is empowering the community rather than just a rubber stamp or checking a box.
Great, thank you, Nate. And Tony, I'm going to turn to you for just 60 seconds of some final remarks before we go to Chris.
Just two last pieces on that. Nate, I think it was a really excellent list. I wanted to talk a little bit about that democratization of knowledge, and to say that that's probably one of our biggest challenges, and just put a reminder to everybody that elected officials have staff that help prep them for the questions that come before them. Nobody says, here's 500 pages, I guess except in Congress, but that was a joke. Here's 500 pages, please decide what you want to do. Those issues get broken down into ways that are meaningful to the members as they vote. We often do not do that when we're doing outreach to communities. And then just the last piece to that, everyone holds out Fresno as a great example, and they are, and they're awesome. But Fresno is an example of a charismatic organization. You had deep relationships with Juana Rambula, Ashley Swearingen, and Pete Weber, that they'd known each other for years. They all had very powerful positions, and it developed over time, and then that evolved with other people coming in. We can't hold that as the standard for everyone because, well, one, charismatic leadership is not necessarily a democracy-led process. So I think that's the challenge. How do we evaluate programs that will bring inclusivity to everyone and not just waiting for the charismatic leader to come forward or the leaders to come forward?
Tony, I would highlight another thing, that's a very good point, is that Fresno is also a place that's had a lot of conflict between groups, including between those leaders. So one of the things I think is really important is how do you take people who have conflicted in the past and bring them into a process where, I always talk about collaboration as being principled conflict. That is, if you're collaborating with people you already like and know, it's just hanging out with your friends. How do you bring into the room people with whom you have some conflicts, but you've got principles you share, and you've got principles about how you would conflict with one another? And that's another lesson from the Fresno experience.
Yeah, one thing I'll say, and as someone who still believes strongly in inland California, we love all of our communities in inland California. And the number of times I see eyes roll when people are like, Fresno becomes, and I can say there have been funders who are like, that is the model that we need to replicate elsewhere. It's like, have you looked under the hood and fully kind of figured out kind of how this works? And I think that's where any place, including in the Bay Area and LA, there are things that are being incubated in different parts of the state that I think should serve as an inspiration to others. And let's have this mindset of always pushing towards that summit, that North Star, right? And so I think and I think everyone here agrees in this room that and Tony fully, that we can't just rely on the accident of what particular leadership looks like, because then you just write off entire communities. One final thing I'll say before turning to Chris, that I think we're going to see this in real time in terms of how do we set up rules and ways that enable more of this to occur. The proof will also be in the pudding, I think, in terms of not just who is being said yes to, but what kind of projects are being told no to or try again. And I think that's going to be so important, because a lot of times there's tremendous pressure when time is of the essence to get players, and usually it is communities that have been marginalized and disenfranchised, to just bite their lip and just be grateful for what they have and be part of these more powerful coalitions that are then going to grab the big pieces of meat or the big piece of fish, or whatever analogy you want to talk about. I am hopeful that we will have an opportunity to learn that it's not going to be business as usual. And hopefully there's more than one round, so that you don't want the failures to be costly, but it shouldn't just be failures based on, oh, you didn't have enough capacity and that's what didn't get you there. It's like, what if you had all the capacity, but you really failed on the inclusion part? You should be able to say no to something like that. State of California, I'm just like looking at the room here. Or at least people should know early on that that is not something that would do very well with an opportunity like SURF, but also other opportunities. Ideally, it would not just be these special programs, that this would just be par for the course in what we do in state government and local governments in California. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris. Chris, you've heard a ton of different things today, and you have the unenviable position of trying to synthesize and leave us with some concluding thoughts.
Well, and the challenge of also trying to be as short as possible, that we can still have a little time for questions from our audience. So just to let you all know, I will try and be very short, like less than 4 minutes, so that we also have an opportunity to hear from you what's on your mind. But I want to lift up 4 concepts or issues that I think are really important. One is time. And time came up in a couple of different ways. One is about this transformational moment we're in, and can we take advantage of it for racial justice and an inclusive economy? But I think the other important thing that's really essential to keep in mind is the long-term time trajectory. People have been working on inclusive economic development and community development for many, many years. And how do we understand those communities in history and the nuances that Sylvia and others have talked about? And also think about the long-term infrastructure building, both the physical infrastructure and the social infrastructure. So as we take advantage of this moment in time, it needs to be part of this trajectory of progressive social change and really building the community inclusion. I think the second point, inclusion, and several people mentioned both that it's the greatest challenge to do that in a real way, and that it's so essential and important. And I think that's what's critical in some of the work that Nate and Alejandro did in the report that they did, is very concrete metrics about inclusion and equity that are not just about outcomes, but really about that process. And so I hope people will look at that report when we actually get it done and out, and really think about the very specific ways of measuring inclusion, so it's real, not just a check in the box. But the second thing about, or the third point, is about readiness. And to recognize we have political challenges related to, there's money to spend, it's part of federal ARPA Act dollars, there's political dynamics about that having an impact. And despite all our discussion about the importance of inclusion, the shovel ready, and Manuel's very articulate terminology of what some of those projects are like, can be really tempting to fund. And I think connected to that, we really have to understand, what does it mean for a region to be inclusion ready, not just shovel ready? And part of that is, if we're looking in these funding opportunities for single collaborators within a region, right? It's a very different thing to build on the Building Healthy Communities tables that Sylvia referenced, compared to, say, the California Economic Summit, California Forward network and tables. Like, that's a very different set of tables to be building on in collaborations. And that's really important to think about that inclusion ready, and how do we understand that in the regions that are out there. And then the final point, since I direct the Institute for Social Transformation, is transformation. Like, what do we mean by change in this moment? How do we not do just business as usual? And where and how does change happen? And Manuel in particular, and others were very articulate about talking about how inland California is essential and increasingly seen that way for all of California, and how community development is increasingly seen as where change needs to happen for all of our economy. The other thing I wanted to point to, though, in that is another framework that Manuel and his team at the Equity Research Institute led, but I had some involvement too, called the Changing States Framework. And part of what this points to is that there are multiple arenas of change, not just electoral or legislative, but Tony mentioned staff of elected officials and assembly committees, and in the corporate arena, and media and communications. But the other thing that's important in that change in states framework is the capacities for change, and that we need to be investing in the organizations that are rooted in these communities, helping to build the alliances and networks that are part of that, and paying specific attention to leadership, leadership ladders, leadership lattices, training the younger generation of leaders, so that Sylvia Paz is inspiring hundreds of similar leaders in the region, and those leaders have the resources to be building those organizational ties. So time, inclusion, readiness, transformation.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. On the notion of transformation, I'll say, often people pit this as an either or, is it power building or is it trying to work with people on the inside or elect more leadership? And I think more and more, we've talked about the California Endowment, other funders, I think even folks within government, with the work that Gare and others are doing, we need to find ways even from within and just including those that are speakers today, those in the audience. I know the commitment is not just among those that are, working directly with frontline communities, but also those in government agencies and elsewhere, to be those allies, because we know that transformation, Chris, it's going to take all of us in whatever roles we have to make sure that not only we align, but that we can coordinate and make sure that that we use these windows of opportunity. It is a pretty special opportunity that we have in California with the kind of surpluses we had to be able to build so much better with long-term positive consequences. So we're going to open it up to some audience Q&A. So I'm going to try to monitor, I don't know if anyone's raised their hands. I'm going to try to monitor the participants list. Feel free to raise your hand and to unmute yourself. And while we're waiting for that, I know one question that came up from Carla Lopez Del Rio, who's our associate director, was in terms of grant applications. Many of these smaller grassroots organizations, they don't have an army of grant writers who know exactly, what kinds of proposals are more likely to succeed, but also all of the supportive letters, from key decision makers that are going to look favorable. So I'm going to ask Tony and Mary, but even others, how can we build systems or maybe think about technical assistance in those planning phases that can make sure that those smaller organizations have some kind of grant writing authorship power, if you will?
Well, one of the things that our committee is doing is we're actually working individually with members' offices and sharing slides about how they, in their own district, can help community organizations and including individuals get ready. And so one of the things that we're sharing is information about what programs are out there. We have a slide deck that is about what are the key big funding opportunities. We identify the department, agency, the amount, and the name of the program. We're suggesting that organizations redo their data. Like, do you know your community? In a conversation I had with a member's district staff yesterday, we said, well, maybe this is something that you could have your interns and community members work on. What is a current profile of this community? And then help larger organizations identify where are your gaps? Are you really inclusive? And doing all of that right now, prior, as we're waiting for Mary and others to roll their piece out. But anyways, we have a 4-point plan that would allow people to do deeper work today in anticipation of the money, including priority setting, to try to get some of that capacity, but also build relationships to put it forward.
Great, thank you, Tony. Mary, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, in terms of grant writing in general and the ability to access funds. You need to have an organization that has that overhead, and have bodies that are able to do the work. And sometimes if an organization is just getting off the ground, or people are working 2 to 3 jobs, how can you expect people to be able to put forth grant applications. So and it makes me think of what Sylvia mentioned earlier about kind of who's building the table and what table is it. So this is something that like we are actively thinking about right now and talking about right now with our leadership team, and how to address this, as well as some of our other partners. And there are some, looking at the series of investments that came out of the state of California. There's some other ones that really target community capacity and technical assistance. So one of those is the Regional Climate Collaboratives out of Strategic Growth Council. And that's something that in the SURF legislation that we will be working with them. So that legislation specifically targets, providing communities with assistance to be able to apply to grants. So that's in the budget. That's one of the programs that aims to address this gap.
Great, thank you, Mary. Sylvia.
From the perspective of an organization that's addressing things on the ground and overstretched, ideally, I think how it would work is if there are these organizations that are big organizations that are always tracking and connecting these funds and they wanted to apply for a community, that they come to us and say, look, this is what we want to do. We have the capacity to apply. Let's do this together. What would this look like? Let's put up an application. We will lend the resources to write it and submit a good application and support all of those technical things. And then on the other hand, what the state can be looking at to identify, or as one of the, to see, well, how real is this? Are the dollars going where they're intended? Look at the budgets. If the applicant is keeping most of the money, and especially if they're an outside applicant, instead of ensuring that there is that local power, right? Like if money stays in this communities, money spent in this communities, it's multiplied by like 45 or I don't know how much, right? Like that we're looking at where the money's going. And that is something that the state in reviewing the applications can very easily see. Where's the money going and where is it going to impact? Is it going to impact the communities around the Salton Sea, Fresno, or is it going to go back to the Bay Area or someplace else?
Thank you, Sylvia. I don't see any other questions in the chat, and we have just a few minutes left. So I think what I might do is just to do final thoughts in the order that we had. So a speed round, 1 minute each. So Manuel, over to you in terms of final thoughts as we look ahead.
I'm excited about this collaborative and transformative effort that's been evolving in Coachella Valley. And I think you've got a real chance to, certainly be able to access these funds, but actually also to help the state transform its understanding of where it needs to make its investments. So we wrote a book about solidarity economics. I'm beginning to see solidarity economics in practice in the efforts that are coming together here. So I'm super excited.
Thank you, Manuel. Sylvia, over to you.
A lot of excitement, gratitude, and just thank you to the team. And yes, I did call all of you multiple times until you said yes, probably. But this work cannot happen, again, by one individual, by one organization. And I really appreciate that we're all in different places and we can come together to at least to develop the model that can be different and that's rooted in communities that have been overlooked for a long time. So just a lot of gratitude and a lot of hope that we can really make this work.
Thank you, Sylvia. Nate, over to you.
Yeah, first, of course, I just want to say thank you to Sylvia and everyone at Alianza for the opportunity to work on this, Chris, and Alejandro and Karthik and everybody. And I guess, yeah, just the thing that just sticks with me is that inclusion like this is going to require all sorts of participation. And the more participation possible, the more meaningful it's able to be, the more inclusive And the better off for the people and residents of an area like the Salton Sea region we can expect any sort of economic endeavors to be. So maximum participation, meaningful participation.
Thank you, Nate. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you. I really appreciate the privilege of being here at this virtual table with all of you who have been doing this work on the ground and thought leaders in this space. I am really hopeful that and I feel really enthusiastic that the Community Economic Resilience Fund is going to take these principles of inclusivity and turn them into action. And I also welcome public comments when we put them out in November from everybody. And because we want to have that inclusion in the actual process as well. So I will leave it, pass it back to Courtney. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mary. And then Tony, over to you.
Well, I think that really the most powerful part of this for me is the opportunity to be able to learn more, but this combination of research and community practice. And usually when government goes forward, sometimes we don't do either. We don't know what's happening on the ground, and we don't actually use research. So I think very excited about how this comes together. The thing that I would hope happens when we see these funding applications and the reports coming back is whole region transformation, and not just choosing selected groups, but of saying, what about those that have highest level of educational attainment is a high school diploma or a GED. So this whole community transformation, and not just here's my strategy for to get more people to go to 4-year degrees.
Thank you, Tony. And then Chris, final thoughts.
2 sentences. One of the quotes from our book is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that quote, I think, underlines the subtitle of our book, is why mutuality and movements matter. And I think this collaboration and the work that Sylvia has done to bring us all into this process and this communication with the state is a perfect example of why our economy is built on mutuality for the long term.
Thank you, Chris. Well, just really grateful. I mean, the time has flown by, and I think this is just, I had a sense going into it that this would be a very powerful conversation, and it absolutely has been. One thing I might ask is maybe we get together a year from now and kind of look back, right, in terms of these programs, both at the federal level and the state level, would have kind of been well underway. So if maybe I can get that soft commitment from you all, see you in a year, and let's see if we can make history together, and let's see if we can really show other states and the rest of the country how it's done, and pay attention to all of the Californias within, and make sure that we bring everyone along. So thank you all for your time, your engagement, participation, and more to come. Thank you.